Today I'm going to be showing you the most shocking and courageous chess move that Bobby Fischer has ever made. The year is 1958. It's the last round of the Podoroj Interzonal in Slovenia. The 15-year-old Bobby Fischer has the black pieces against one of the best players on the planet, the Yugoslavian Super GM Svetozar Gligoric. And in this position, Bobby busts out the move G5. And to understand just how crazy it is for Fischer to play this move, you need to know this move's history, which I'm going to show you briefly. So we'll need to go back about 3 years to 1955. To the Gothenburg Interzonal Tournament held that year in Sweden, where the strongest grandmasters from Argentina, including Miguel Najdorf himself, were experimenting with the opening that today we know as the Najdorf Sicilian, which occurs after these moves, which I'm sure are all very familiar to you, including, of course, this move A6, played by black on move 5, which is what defines this as the Sicilian Najdorf, which nowadays is one of the most well-known and deeply analyzed openings of all time, but back in 1955, it was still relatively new territory at the highest level, and there was still a lot of experimenting going on, especially by these Argentinians who had adopted this as their new favorite pet opening weapon. Now, there were 3 very strong Argentinian grandmasters at this tournament: Pano, Pilnik, and of course Miguel Najdorf, after whom this variation was named. And they were all eager to score some wins against the Russians. Pano had the first opportunity against none other than the legendary Russian champion Paul Keres, who responded to his Sicilian Najdorf defense with bishop to g5. And after e6, f4, we have this sharp line queen to b6, targeting the pawn on b2, which after queen to d2 from Keres, Pano is too scared to capture. He thinks it's too poisonous and plays it safe with knight to c6. We have castles long, queen takes d4, after which Pano goes on to get mercilessly crushed by the great Keres in this ensuing middle game. I'm going to go through these moves briefly and show you the position where Pano resigned. Here, where he is not going to be able to avoid losing a piece. Not a great start from Team Argentina. So it's back to the drawing board. They of course blame their opening prep for the loss rather than the fact that Pano was trying to take down a Russian chess superstar. But okay, never hurts to try to improve your opening and try to invent some new dangerous novelty. So they analyzed into the wee hours of the morning and came up with, in this position, bishop to e7. Okay, that's not the novelty. They just chose that instead of queen to b6. The real novelty comes after queen to f3, h6, bishop to h4, where of course black plays the now infamous g5, which looks kind of nuts, but it of course does have some logic to it, being the fruit of so many hours of Argentinian analysis. But would any of them have a chance to play it? Well, that question was answered in a spectacular way in round 14 when all 3 of these Argentinian grandmasters got to spring their little g5 trap at the same time against 3 Russian legends of the game, Keres, Spassky, and Geller. Now, this may have seemed like a stroke of luck at the time, but it actually ended up being a curse, and you're going to see why. All 3 games continued, f takes g5, and now knight f to d7 from Team Argentina. This is black's idea. You lure away white's f-pawn from hitting the e5 square so you can post your knight there. And white's pawn is pinned to his bishop on h4, so you're going to get that pawn back. And at this point, all 3 Russians are looking at this exact position on the board at the same time, wondering how they're going to deal with this weird plan. Geller is the first to act, and he uncorks a knight sacrifice with knight takes e6. And after f takes e6, he plays queen to h5 check. And now, I don't know at what moment it happened, but at some point, all 3 Russians caught on to the fact that there were 3 identical games going on. And what do you think they did? Well, they put all their faith in Geller. That's what they did. Apparently, he had the reputation for being the most tactically sharp out of the 3. Kerez and Spassky literally just kept walking over to Geller's board, saw what he was doing, and just copied his game move by move, which seems kind of unfair, but it's not against the tournament rules. You are allowed to walk around and observe other games that are being played. So in all 3 games, the knight was sacrificed. There was this queen to h5 move, driving the king to f8, and then came a spectacular move, played by Geller, of course, and that was, pause the video if you want to try to spot it, it's the double exclam worthy bishop to b5. Really an incredible move to find over the board. Almost looks random, right? But it's actually the only good move for white here, because it's critical to keep black from permanently establishing a knight on e5 and guarding these kingside light squares, because that's where white wants to attack. He's got a checkmate threat starting with castles, putting the rook on f1. So black has no time to capture the bishop on b5. He needs to defend his kingside. And here's where we had a divergence. In the Geller versus Pano game, knight to e5 was tried. And after bishop to g3, looking to eliminate this knight, the defender of these squares, we can see the purpose of bishop to b5 come into play. And that is to eliminate the other knight if it plays to c6 or d7 to try to support its buddy on e5. So what Pano tried here was bishop takes g5. We have castles with check. The king goes to e7. The knight's eliminated on e5, of course. Pano throws in this check for good measure. King to h1. D takes e5, takes out the bishop. But here comes the invasion with queen to f7 check. King goes to d6. And you can see where this is going. Black has to start sacking material in order to delay mate. Queen d4 is played, rook takes d4 check, and the game did not last much longer after e takes d4. So that's what happened to Pano. In the other 2 games, Najdorf and Pielnik decided to try something else. In this position, instead of playing knight to e5, they went for king to g7, getting the king out of the way right away. They both lasted a bit longer, but nevertheless, they were both defeated in virtually an identical way, which wouldn't have been possible without some incredible moves by white. Their games continued identically with castles, knight to e5, guarding f7, bishop to g3, looking to eliminate the knight, but now black has time to drop it into g6, which almost looks like a defense, but here comes g takes h6 check, rook takes h6, and now the beautiful rook to f7 check, drawing the king away from the defense of this rook on h6. So we have queen takes h6, a takes b5. The bishop had to be taken so the king can escape to the e8 square. After rook to f1 check, king to e8, but now queen takes g6, picks up the knight. Black still has an extra piece, but look at those pieces. His entire queen side is undeveloped. He now runs to d7 with his king. The rook infiltrates. We have knight to c6, and now the beautiful knight to d5. Neither Argentinian grandmaster captured that knight, but if they had, let me just show you what would happen. Something like this: e takes d5, queen takes d6 check. The bishop here is pinned, cannot capture the queen. And so after king to e8, there would be queen to g6, setting up the brutal discovery. There's all kinds of nasty lines in here for white that you can explore if you want. The engine is suggesting just bishop to e6, which just loses the queen for black after rook takes e7 with check. It's a discovered check, it's a double check, so there is no queen capture. The king must do the job, but then here comes bishop to h4 check. You're going to pick up the black queen. So taking this knight on d5 is out. The Argentinians knew it. What they tried instead was rook takes a2, at which point their 2 games finally diverged. Kerez played h4, while Spassky went with h3 against Pielnik. But both of the Argentinian grandmasters lost in a very similar way. I'll just show you the rest of the Spassky-Pielnik game very briefly, and then we're going to get to the Bobby Fischer game, I promise. But we had queen to h8, trying to infiltrate to d4, make something happen with that check. But after knight takes e7, knight takes e7, queen to g5, the black queen is forced to hang back and defend the pinned knight on e7. Pielnik throws in a check with rook to a1. The king has the h2 square, then defends with the queen. We have queen takes b5 with check. King goes to c7, and now queen to c5 check. Very nice. This d pawn is pinned. It's going to be captured on the next move, and there will be no saving this knight on e7. King to b8 is played. King to d7 wouldn't have helped, because either way, there's going to be bishop takes d6 check. King a8 played the game. The knight is captured, and here Spassky is now 3 pawns up, totally winning. We have a couple more moves, rook to a5, queen to b4, and it's at this point that Pielnik resigns, having a completely hopeless position. So what a disaster. Suffice to say that the Argentinian's secret opening weapon g5 was a spectacular failure, resulting in 3 losses. And so this turn of events went down in history with the name the Argentine Tragedy. And their failed opening novelty, now known as the Gothenburg variation, named after Gothenburg, Sweden, the city where it was played, was disregarded and considered to be completely refuted. No strong player would touch it, and so the opening lay dormant, long forgotten as the months and years passed. Well, 3 years anyway. Which brings us to the year 1958, where a 15-year-old Bobby Fischer begins to secretly study this opening, focusing on this position where white has just played bishop to b5. And he became convinced that black is not losing here, and that the correct defense is neither of the moves tried by the Argentinian grandmasters. It's not king to g7, and it's not knight to e5. Can you spot it? Pause the video if you like, and see if you can find Fischer's improvement. In 3, 2, 1. It's rook to h7, and after studying this for hours, Bobby Fischer became convinced that black could not only survive the knight sacrifice, but he could even win if white is not careful. So Fischer was eager to try out his new and improved Gothenburg variation, and that opportunity came in the 1958 interzonal in Podorož, Slovenia, against Svetozar Gligoric, who Fischer had actually been spending some time with during this tournament. They'd done some swimming together in this beautiful river, and at one point before their game, Fischer even showed his idea to Gligoric and asked him what he thought about it. Well, Gligoric dismissed the move, didn't think it was worthy of his attention, and didn't take the 15-year-old Bobby Fischer very seriously. And so what did Bobby do in the final round of the tournament when he got this position against Gligoric himself, giving him the chance to play the notorious Gothenburg line? Well, of course, he played it. And when Bobby thrusted that pawn to g5, you better believe that the audience was absolutely stunned. No one had dared touch this line in 3 years, since it was assumed to be totally losing for black. But Gligoric now realized, to his horror, that Bobby didn't think it was losing, and that he had just walked right into a firestorm of home preparation, and he might as well just add 20 hours to Fischer's clock. But you gotta hand it to Gligoric. He tried to call Fischer's bluff, even though it wasn't really a bluff, as you'll soon see. After f takes g5, knight f to d7, he played that same knight sacrifice which was supposed to win, saying, "Prove it to me, young man." And after f takes e6, we have the same line played 3 years earlier, queen to h5 check, king to f8, with Geller's brilliant bishop to b5, setting the stage for Bobby Fischer's big improvement. The only good defense for black, and the top choice of Stockfish, that move was rook to h7, looking to use that rook to shield his king. And at this point, Bobby got up, began walking around the tournament hall, looking at other games, looking relaxed, like he didn't have a care in the world. And Geller, seeing this, knew that he was in for a difficult uphill battle. But despite the immense psychological disadvantage he now had, he didn't crack. He played on, and he played well, avoiding castling right away, seeing that after king to g8, queen to g6 check, because the black rook has moved to h7, the black king can hide over here on h8 and is relatively safe. White's attack has kind of fizzled out here, and white does not have sufficient compensation for the lost piece and is therefore losing. So instead of castling right away, Gligoric tried queen to g6 first. But now comes rook to f7 from Bobby, shielding his king from a rook check on f1. Queen takes h6 check. Gligoric now has 3 pawns for the lost piece, and so is not down in material anymore. King to g8, queen to g6 check. The rook blocks. He picks up another pawn on e6, now 4 pawns for the piece. White's bishop is still hit on a6, hence the move bishop takes d7. We have knight takes d7. Gligoric castles long, and this is a very imbalanced position. Gligoric is still 1 pawn up in material, but after knight to e5 with the discovery on the queen and queen to d5, we have bishop to g4. And suddenly, it's Bobby Fischer who has the initiative. His pieces are getting very active. The white rook is hit, and so it moves to the open file, rook d to f1. The game continued with bishop takes g5 check. Fischer capturing the pawn, which despite equalizing the material, is not the best move. You're just helping white trade off his bishop on h4, which was in kind of a passive defensive position. And that g5 pawn was not going anywhere anyway. But Bobby is being cautious, returning the material count to equilibrium. He wants to make sure he doesn't lose this game, and there's a reason for that. In this final round of the tournament, Bobby is competing for 6th place, which was significant because that was the minimum placing to qualify him for the upcoming candidates tournament, which meant a shot at the World Championship. He knew that he may need to win this game, which is why when Gligoric offered him a draw at some point during this middle game, Bobby refused. Now instead of bishop takes g5, Stockfish is suggesting rook to c8 for black, and after king to b1, sacking the exchange. Very scary stuff for white, though it's not really clear if black is actually winning here. But getting back to the game, bishop takes g5 check from Bobby. We had bishop takes g5, queen takes g5 with check, the king goes to b1, and the queen goes back to e7, defending that d6 pawn. Now comes queen to d2, getting out of the way of Bobby's next move, bishop to e6. Gligoric obviously anticipated this centralizing maneuver. g3, so the queen doesn't have to defend against rook takes g2. And now rook to d8, rook to f4, getting ready to double on the open file. Queen to g5, queen to f2, king to g8 from Bobby, defending against a rook infiltration, preparing rook to f7 to challenge white on that open file. And so Gligoric turns his attention to the d file with rook to d1. Maybe he'll play knight to d5. We have rook to f7, b3, giving the king some luft, stopping any knight to c4. Both players are playing well here. We have queen to e7 now from Bobby. It's kind of tame, adding some defense to d6, but around this point, there was an interesting development in the tournament. The player that Bobby Fischer was in competition for that coveted 6th place was David Bronstein. And Bobby at some point became aware that Bronstein had got himself into a disastrous losing position, which meant that all Bobby needed to do now was make a draw, and he would get that important 6th place that he wanted, and a potential shot at the World Championship. And this is probably why, after just a few more moves, Bobby finally agreed to that draw with Gligoric in this position. Now, knowing what kind of player Bobby was, if the tournament situation had been any different, he would have undoubtedly played on here and pushed for that win. Now, Stockfish says this position is dead equal, but it's extremely imbalanced, and Gligoric remarked years later that he thought Fischer's position was better. So, Fischer's position was psychologically winning, if nothing else. And so that is how Fischer was able to dramatically resurrect this Gothenburg line from its grave, like some kind of zombie coming back from the dead with this move g5, which might make you wonder, if you are a connoisseur of the Sicilian defense, why don't we see this move more often today? I mean, I've never seen it anywhere else besides this game. Well, it turns out that there's more to this story. Of course, this opening was heavily analyzed after Fischer played it, And it was discovered that after f takes g5 and knight f to d7, that the knight sacrifice is not actually the strongest move. It turns out that queen to h5 immediately gives white the most significant advantage. But is it enough to win? Well, apparently most grandmasters thought so because they continued to stay away from this opening in the subsequent years. But after some deep analysis with Stockfish, it seems to me that black can actually hold this position, and there is no forced win for white. So I'll just briefly show you a couple lines suggested by Stockfish. The engine gives knight to e5, bishop to g3, looking to eliminate the knight of course, bishop takes g5, bishop to e2, and queen to b6, counterattacking that b2 pawn. And at this point Stockfish kept changing its mind between these two moves, knight to f3 and rook to d1. So I had it analyze both. Let's first look at the knight to f3 line. I had Stockfish play about 6 or 7 moves here, and we ended up with this position where the computer says it's only about a half a pawn in white's favor, which is not even near a guaranteed win. White here, despite being a pawn down, has some pressure with his better piece development, his castled king, but it seems that according to Stockfish, black should be able to survive. Now the other line it liked was this one beginning with rook to d1. This leads us to quite a different situation, but the evaluation after these moves ends up being about the same, only about a half a pawn in white's favor. So it seems this opening is still perfectly acceptable for black, and so it could be an interesting weapon for you to try in your own games if you get the chance. Your opponent, who most likely is not familiar with this opening, will probably not play knight takes e6 in this position. They may not find queen to h5 either. You're going to get that beautiful e5 square for your knight, and so it may be an interesting way to mix things up in your own games. You might be able to catch one of your opponents by surprise, just like Bobby Fischer did to Gligoric back in 1958. So thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed this story and maybe even got an addition to your opening repertoire here. Please subscribe to the channel if you haven't already for more content a lot like this coming your way soon, and I will see you on the next one.